Okay, I think it's recording. Yeah.
Great.
So, welcome to the session, Greg, and thank you for taking on this responsibility of explaining to us the terrain of like Mauna Kea. And For the class, this is like Professor Greg Johnson, and who's been a friend for like many years now, and like collaborated quite closely on the project Indigenous like religions that I talked to you guys about. Greg is a professor in like religious studies in the like University of California, Santa Barbara, and also the director of the like Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life. Um, Greg has got lots of experience, of course, in like various aspects of Indigenous people's rights, their kind of issues around like Mauna Kea and so on, and has written like widely on this issue. And I will upload some of his articles as well in alongside this talk. So just to open up the like conversation, Greg, I mean, it might be quite useful to give us a sense of like Mauna Kea, the protest, and how did it start? I mean, what are the key issues? I mean, who are the main actors, and so on.
Wonderful. Well, I wish I could be speaking with all you students live, but alas, this is the world we live in right now. So thanks for your patience. And thank you, Arco, for this invitation. Happy to be here. Um, as you know, Arco, I've been so immersed in this topic of the Mauna Kea conflict for some time that if I tell the story in a way that's scaled in too closely, jump in and say, wait, a little more context, please.
Yeah.
But to begin the story, we are talking about the most remote island chain in the world, Hawaii. It's furthest from any continental landmass of any significant archipelago, so that's notable. Mauna Kea is the tallest mountain in the archipelago and also the tallest mountain in the entire Pacific. So we're talking about an absolutely notable uh, landform that has been central to Native Hawaiians and their religious lives since they arrived in Hawaii, which is on the order of 2 millennia ago. Um, it stands about 4,200 meters tall, so it's actually an alpine environment. Most of us have images of Polynesia that are entirely tropical, which is largely correct, but this is an alpine environment, and that bears noting. The issue here is that because of the height and remoteness of Mauna Kea, it is a location extremely well suited for astronomical observation for telescopes. And since the 1960s, the University of Hawaii, in conjunction with the state of Hawaii and the federal US government, has sponsored and built various telescope projects at the summit of Mauna Kea. There are now 13 telescopes, and these are quite large, many stories tall. Uh, and a new project is being proposed now, the so-called 30-meter telescope. This is it's absolutely gigantic, far it dwarfs anything else up there, and it's become the proposal to build the telescope has inflamed the local Native Hawaiian community. Not all Hawaiians, there are Hawaiians on both sides of this issue, but it's become the signature flashpoint moment in contemporary Hawaiian political, legal, and religious discourse over the last 5 or 6 years. And let me say this: the Native Hawaiians who are challenging this project, it's not that they're anti-science. In fact, their entire voyaging tradition throughout Polynesian getting to Hawaii depended on star navigation and so forth. They regard themselves as deeply empirical people. Their daily lives, as with all humans and all indigenous peoples, is predicated on intense observation of the natural environment, engagement with it. So a narrative that is often announced in the media is wrong, that this is just a conflict between Enlightenment science on the one hand, as represented by the Telescope Corporation, and bereft natives on the other side who are fundamentalist in their religious sensibilities and unwilling to engage modernity. That is not the story. It's a story about the failure of the state and the corporation to meaningfully engage Native Hawaiians about the use of this land, and about their absolute inability to seek consent. And that's the current United Nations standard. I know in this class you're reading the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that articulates the ideal of consent. And of course, this is an ideal that immediately makes sense to most anybody, that that people should have the right to agree or disagree with uses of their land. And this is how Native Hawaiians regard Mauna Kea, as their land. And this is not fantasy on their part. It's demonstrable historically that their kingdom was overthrown by the United States in 1893, and that has never been legally adjudicated in anything like a fair way. And that Native Hawaiians feel this incredible religious and cultural sensibility towards Mauna Kea. It's the site of ancestral burials, of origin stories, of ongoing religious life, an unbroken chain of religious life. And so in 2015, as the telescope project was beginning to materialize in a concrete form with construction vehicles and so forth, many members of the Native Hawaiian community rallied among themselves, principally using social media to do so, Facebook and so forth, and staged an encampment protest on the Mauna. They succeeded in stopping the state from escorting up construction vehicles. I witnessed that. I was there for these days. And through being there, through witnessing these acts of defiance, of trespass as constituted by the state, I was drawn into this issue and have paid attention closely ever since, and myself have become a witness in the case. And then I'll come back to the religious issues in just a moment. The Native Hawaiians in 2015, as I mentioned, prevailed in stopping construction at that moment. Then issues went back into the court for several years. And then finally in 2018, the State Supreme Court of Hawaii authorized the next wave of construction and gave direction that there should not be further protests and so forth. Predictably, once again, protests did occur. This was the summer of 2019, and it was an encampment protest again. And this time the duration was on the order of 9 months, of hundreds of people camped in the road, the single access point to the mountain, Native Hawaiians and allies and other indigenous peoples, it bears stating. And they comported themselves in ritual 3 times a day, every day in the road as a means to demonstrate against what was happening. Then about this time last year, COVID hit us all. And the Hawaiians in the camp, out of deference to their elders, decided that they would stand down for the moment, so long as the state agreed that it would not pursue construction during the COVID period. So at the moment, bringing it up to the present, there is a detente of sorts, a stasis on the mountain where the protesters have stood down, the state has stood down, construction is not happening. However, in the interim, the Telescope Corporation has made every gesture that they intend to continue. The state has said they will support the Telescope Corporation. So it's this continued narrative from the side of power in that sense that this will take place. It's just a matter of getting the pesky protesters out of the way. Meanwhile, the Native Hawaiian community has largely consolidated around this issue. It's become a narrative of who they are and how they wish to move into the future, to touch upon the themes of the class, how they wish to protect their land. And they're unshakable in their resolve. And this, as an outside scholar who's become part of this, it frankly blows my mind that the state and the Telescope Corporation is so in denial about the resolve of people on the ground, about their humanity, and about their cultural rights. So I want to talk more about that. But let me underscore here, and we'll come back to it, the religious element of these protests. It's not separable from what's going on politically. It is a full-throated cultural manifestation of people who've whose religious traditions have always incorporated friction and positioning themselves vis-a-vis proximate others and having to struggle through these relationships in religious ways with religious imagination and ritual and so forth. So this is not an instance of pursuing a political goal through the veneer of religion. This is the way Hawaiians engage religiosity in many respects. And forms of Native Hawaiian religious life that don't appear to be political, I submit, have been largely denaturalized, that they have been taken out of context, neutralized for the sake of the tourist gaze, other forms of consumption. Conflict is part of Native Hawaiian religious life, and seeking resolution to it for the benefit of future generations and the land itself animates the core of Hawaiian religious sensibilities. So let me say a few further words about that. You're reading a piece by Noelani Goodyear Ka'opoa, and it's a fabulous piece about indigenous futurisms in Hawaii centered on the Mauna Kea dispute. She brings up the language of aloha aina. Aloha means love or welcoming. Aina means land. Aloha aina has become the rallying cry of many contemporary Hawaiians as the signature phrase that captures their sensibility of how Native Hawaiians relate to their lands and what they're willing to do to express that relationship. Played out another way it's framed by the Aloha Aina movement is this: the Kanaka need the Aina needs Kanaka. Kanaka means people, Native Hawaiians. Aina again is land. So the people need the land needs the people. This has become the rallying cry on Mauna Kea, but also in other contested sites of where the military has abused the land, where hotel ownership has denuded the land and so forth. So that constant rallying cry. Well, let's unpack that just a little bit. It's a multi-generational claim. Again, with an eye towards the future, there's such an emphasis on the keiki, or the children, in these movements of educating them into ritual lives of care for the land. So in the protest camps that I've been part of, in the discourse that I've heard and witnessed, this refrain of how to grow the children into the tradition through care of the land, it's a constant refrain, and it's facilitated also at the other end of the generational scale by drawing in the elders. The appeal of the middle generations to the elders to say, Grandma, Grandpa, please teach the children your wisdom. Let them understand that you've been caring for the land, that we have always cared for the land. I find this in a protest context so powerful, because so often when we think of protests, we think of, youth and the marginal and so forth. So we don't often think of grandparents and grandchildren and families and nurturing. That's what's taking place on Mauna Kea, is nurturing of tradition through the extended family unit, collaborating with other extended family units to form just a kind of cultural momentum that is really humbling, frankly, from an outside perspective. So it's not fiction in the least to talk about how these young children will be carrying forward Hawaiian tradition, because they're doing it already. Another thing I want to elaborate here is how sovereignty plays out. And Arco has helped me think so much about how sovereignty works in different locations. And I'm going to borrow some of his ideas here a little bit. Hawaiians, since the time of the overthrow, as I mentioned, this is 1893, have consistently and full-throatedly argued for and agitated for a restoration of the Hawaiian kingdom. This is their grand aspiration, and it's something we see. And I would say that this is what I would call a version of maximal sovereignty. That is a hope and articulation of a full return of land, of a past, of a future, of autonomy, agency, of political rights. It's that all-encompassing imagination. And from a religious studies perspective, I would call it a kind of myth, not myth in the sense of false story, but myth in the sense of an enabling maximal narrative, right? But I would look, and this is where Arco's helped me think about it, to something that accompanies that. And I would call this tactical sovereignty. That is, that maximal version of sovereignty, the ideal version, isn't obtainable today, tomorrow. The future and the protection of the land depends on something much more grounded, much more tactical, proximate agitations, proximate acts, piecemeal bits here and there of functional sovereignty, of insisting on food sovereignty, on a road blockade, on educating children into the language, all these bits and pieces of cultural life that aren't usually talked about in the idiom of sovereignty actually can't be understood otherwise, it seems to me. And this is what Noelani Goodyear Kaupoa also argues for in a different kind of language, but these reconstituting these different pieces of cultural life and animating them in the direction of that maximal version of sovereignty. So I'd really call your attention to that relationship between the tactical and the maximal. And the tactical side, I would suggest, if the maximal resembles myth or is a kind of myth, the tactical draws its animation, I would suggest, largely from ritual forms of people coming together on the ground, on the land, inspired by the ecology around them to perform traditional acts in the direction of a future that is once again theirs in an unqualified sense, but it steps along the way. I'm unpacking a lot here, but I wanted to get a few ideas out so we have something to talk with further. The concept of a few other issues real quick, and then I invite Arco to push me on some different questions and issues. One thing you'll be reading about is the concept of refusal. Perhaps you've already begun talking about it. And this functions here too in both the maximal formation of sovereignty and the more tactical aspects of realizing it. So often indigenous peoples are approached by nation state in the mode of consultation. That is, the state comes and says, we're going to tell you what we intend to do with your lands. Now you've heard, we can check that box, you agree. Native peoples have grown tired of that. They don't see that as meaningful engagement. Again, the standard, the international standard should be consent, right? So in the wake of histories of failed consultation, of trivial engagement, people are beginning to refuse, to simply say, you know what, our future doesn't depend on our listening to your narrative about us now. We have our own stories to tell, and we're going to preserve our precious emotional resources, our precious time, our precious capital, and our children's energy, and we're going to refuse to listen to you. We're just going to do what we will do. And maybe that sounds simple-minded, but being in protest camps and seeing that spirit be expressed over and over and over has really powerfully shaped how I think about these moments. And that refusal can happen on the ground, it can happen in legislative sessions, it can happen in the media, but this movement of indigenous peoples to say, you know what, a compromised sovereignty or mere consultation isn't what we're here for. That doesn't begin to capture our future. So I would urge you to pay attention to that language. Many scholars are working with it, but people on the ground are as well. I find that a real interesting aspect of all of this. So, and then just a note on my own involvement, I mentioned I became a witness in the case. I was during the protest movements, both in 2015 and again in 2019, I witnessed so much of the ritual life going on. And some of the Hawaiians I'm close to said, well, as a scholar of religion, would you be willing in a legal context to describe what you've seen as religious in the hopes of triggering protections under state and federal law around religious freedoms? And when asked by a community one has worked with for years, the answer isn't going to be no. I owe so much to the people I work with, and also genuinely, as a scholar of religion, what I see, what I saw there, unambiguously religion in the most robust sense. And I think any scholar of religion who took time to get to know it would agree. In any case, the point is, I agreed to testify, and I was drawn into a rather long process around this. I am not convinced that my testimony helped. It may have. Um, it opened up a lot of questions for me about the role of scholars in these sorts of settings. What I can say for sure is I am far better connected to the Native Hawaiian community now than I was before being involved at this level. I have a far better sense of their religious aspirations and of the texture of their claims than I ever would have otherwise. Um, but how I choose to speak about that, write about that, teach about that has become very unsettled for me, because I've been drawn into a world of confidence, in a sense, and a world of precarity. Uh, and so it's put me in a space of being very, very cautious about how I think about my role moving forward. And I've put a little bit of a hold on some of my scholarship for the moment while I just simply process the stakes. Business as usual, where the outside scholar, particularly non-native one, just comes in, gets involved, and then writes what he or she wishes and moves on. That day should be gone. And so I'm trying to imagine my scholarship in a much more grounded way, but I'm not there yet. It's a real struggle for me, but one that I have the privilege of time and space to work through. I just want to signal that my situation stands for lots of people, in the sense that I think in the academy, particularly in religious studies and in Indigenous studies, we're beginning to reckon with what would a decolonial study of religion look like, and how might we privileged folks better support Indigenous futures. And not, so I think the contours of the problem are increasingly clear. The map towards the solution, not so clear. And I'm so grateful for people like Arco and other colleagues in the project to help think about how might we find this map. Don't have access to it just yet. Anyhow, I've said already a lot of things. And I invite Arco, would you jump in and give me
Yeah.
some direction here?
Yes, I mean, thanks a lot, like Greg. I think that overview was like really helpful. It has given us a lot to think about. I mean, I just wanted to kind of ask if you could give us a sense of the camps, in the like Mauna Kea, especially the protests, the atmosphere. I mean, is it a lot of people? Is it a small group? Is it like is there singing? Is there ceremony? I mean, how does that operate? If you could just like give us a like glimpse of that the scene, as it were.
Absolutely. First, remind me offline later to send you some links to a few of the kind of nutshell videos that best capture this. I think that
Okay, right.
those will convey so much to your students. But yeah, I thank you for the question. And I want to underscore this. The camps are joyful places. They're stressful because everyone's there illegally. They know they could be arrested. Many have been arrested. Uh, it's not beyond the pale that there could be violence. That specter looms. But the sense of community, of that multi-generational sense of community, the sense of allyship with other indigenous peoples, other Polynesians, Tahitians, Samoans, others coming to support their brothers and cousins and sisters, American Indians, First Nations people coming, the random outsider like me being there. It creates a sense, festive is the wrong word, but hopeful, joyous. Just the optimism is really contagious, in the sense of it's a special place, kind of a liminal space where the usual constraints and obligations of daily life don't abide, or at least are held at bay in a way that people can free up some of their emotional energy to devote to imagining futures, to ministering to the landscape. So daily life, just to give you a sense, each day in the camps, and to your question, in 2019, sometimes there were on the order of 5,000 people. That would be the kind of outside biggest number when like Jason Momoa showed up and the camp swelled.
Mhm.
Typically on the order of 1,000, 2,000 people. So still a small town worth of people camped in the middle of a road on a lava field, on a volcano, on an island. It's rather dramatic. But so food, people would coordinate intensively to have aipono, or traditional foods when possible, other foods when necessary, but so much energy around food and eating. And this will resonate with anyone who knows such context. But most of all, the daily schedule was a ritual schedule. Wake up when? To the sunrise. And do what? Pray to the sunrise. How? Collectively. In what idiom? Song. So I'd still be in my tent, waking up at 5:30 in the morning, and boom, resonating across the lava field, just chanting in Hawaiian, welcoming the sun up, and hustling to get over there. Like, oh shit, I was late again. And just to recognize the resolve and intensity of people to do that every morning. It can be cold up there too. And then an hour break to eat breakfast. Then what? Ritual. 3 times a day, full what they call protocol of all the welcoming songs to welcome anyone who just came, all the protocol that goes with that, teaching the newcomers how to behave in ritual, and then conducting it's a series of 10 chants and dances each time, 3 times a day, and then formal gift giving, and then another meal, then a break for educational circles, then the full ritual again, then a break for a meal, educational circles, and then the full ritual again at sunset. Every day for 9 months, they didn't miss a single ritual. And there, by the way, they're mostly archived. I'll send Arco a link to where you can find this online so you can witness what this looks like. And some days it was fairly humdrum. It would be a cold, windy day. They would just do it, get it done, move on. Other days, it would be, a spectacle in the best sense of just so many families enjoying themselves. The idiom was largely native Hawaiian language. So, and I'm so grateful for your question, because this isn't merely a question of will they succeed in blocking the telescope or not. The kind of larger issue is a space for the fructification of tradition has been a highly generative space in a context of friction, has been carved out intentionally. And the lessons from that space are going to reverberate considerably, whether or not they succeed in this particular instance. So in fact, Hawaiian tradition won't be the same moving forward. It's been so powerfully impacted by this moment, by the collective. Let me just say this last thought here. As with any tradition, there are many fractures and lines of tension within the Native Hawaiian community. Most of those were set aside in this context. There were some people who continued to object to the protests. There were some Hawaiians who just chose not to be involved, whether they objected or not. But overwhelmingly, institutions, religious leaders, educators across the spectrum, many of whom are not radical, many of whom did not participate in the first round of protests, came to embrace this as a quintessential Hawaiian moment. And it's really reshaped the politics of possible futures for Hawaiians when they could get so many community leaders with so many different kinds of resources back on board to imagine how they could be Hawaiian 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out. I mean, in my time working in Hawaii, the proximate kind of goal for most struggles was, the next month, the next year, how do we win this very precise battle? Now that tactical sense of sovereignty is creeping out towards the more maximal sense of sovereignty, like, oh my gosh, we're getting momentum. We have a vision. We have a kind of ethic of collaboration that's tending towards a vision that might just take hold. And that sense of hopefulness, it's humbling. And I have to say, 20 years ago, the restored kingdom narrative struck my ears as fanciful and possibly even a waste of time, like delusion. What are you really? The United States military is going to go away in the wake of your claims? Now, with the crumbling power of the US and the ability of Hawaiians to nurture and care for their spaces and grow community accordingly, I have to concede that things have changed. And that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, very interesting. I think the crumbling power of this, or kind of the crumbling power of the state, and yeah, I mean, all of the questions, that like one can ask about that. But I mean, I wanted to go back to your point about um, science, and I think a part of your comment, uh, I think you're absolutely like right that this debate is not about science versus indigenous knowledge, or sometimes, of course, the kind of like media presents it as Western science, and with the kind of telescope and trying to kind of look out into space and investigate the stars and all of that, right? And how these kind of native Hawaiians are kind of ignorant of kind of development and progress. And that juxtaposition, I think, sometimes tends to be quite wide ranging in a lot of the kind of discussions about indigenous development. And so if states or companies come in to say kind of develop, or to say like drill oil, or kind of mine for like bauxite, or they talk about this is about your kind of development as well, that we create jobs and so on. So I mean, I wanted to ask if the, um well, I mean, it's not a black and white issue. So how do people kind of navigate the terrain of, say, science and indigenous knowledge, in the context of like Mauna Kea?
Yeah. I'm hesitating because, of course, there's no one answer.
Yeah.
I would say that on one end of the spectrum, there are some people who um, do sound fundamentalist, if you will. That's not how they would think of it, but uncompromising emphasis on traditional knowledge and the framing of Mauna Kea as only and everywhere a sacred space that can brook no other use. Um, and they would extend that argument metonymically to other aspects of Hawaiian land and places that other kinds of encroachments that aren't Hawaiian simply can't be um, engaged. Okay. But as with any culture, any movement, there are going to be other voices. And I would say the primary voice, kind of more in the middle of the spectrum, is people who say, we're of this world. We live in 2021. We, of course, out of necessity, but also out of opportunity, embrace the possibilities and promises of science, even in a hedging way of capitalism, of market economies. They have to, they're in a touristic setting. But again, back to the question of consent, they want to say we agency and recognition of our full humanity in that agency needs to be the guiding principle for how we choose to engage those spheres.
Mm, mm,
And the more the state and corporations and educational institutions refuse to engage them in that conversation, the more they get pushed back to the other end of the spectrum, where they just say, well, then, aole, which means no, the maximal refusal, complete shutting down of any discursive back and forth. So as an outsider, it's been frustrating for me to see the state consistently misread the situation.
mm,
They pre-frame so many of the encounters as having intractable nature of the Hawaiians always and everywhere wanting maximal sovereignty, not willing to compromise, not willing to engage. And so, that's not actually the case. If you took care to really understand where they're coming from, but they do lead with the notion of consent. And I think that's just it, right? That's such a challenge to the hubris of the state to think that peoples should have a voice equal to or greater than the settler state is an affront to basically Enlightenment reason as exported as a colonial mechanism.
mm, mm.
If you follow, but and then there are, back to just the question about science, there are a number of Native Hawaiian astronomers Not a huge number, but a number. Some are pro telescope, and they articulate their reasons for. But others say, you know what, we're Native Hawaiian astronomers, we're pro astronomy, but not on our sacred land and not without consent. So again, it's not a refusal to engage the idea of science at this level. It's refusal to continue to tolerate an expansionist state on their lands.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know how to better say it than that, but yeah.
No, I
And
think
then
that's accurate. Yeah.
one last thought, a number of Hawaiians, and I would point people, I'll send you the link. There's a lecture by a gentleman called Kalekoa Ka'eo. He gave for the CAP Center that I run, and it's on a video of it's online, and he goes on at length. It's about in Native Hawaiian origin stories in the cosmos. And the opening 10 or 12 minutes, he describes kind of the parallelisms between Hawaiian cosmogonic stories, stories of the origins, with scientific understandings of the same, so as to position himself as someone saying, okay, on the one hand, I'm a radical activist who's against the telescope. On the other hand, we Hawaiians are fully of an empirical world. Our ancestors have made such assessments for many millennia. And if engaged in a fair way, we could work with you on what good science might look like. It might not be on Mauna Kea, it might not be even in Hawaii, but that's not where the struggle is. The struggle is with recognizing their humanity and their claims to sovereignty.
Okay. No, I think that's very helpful. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of consent, and I think a lot of indigenous peoples are actually not against science or kind of development, but it's the kind of issue about consent because they're not asked, and the state just comes in and just kind of bulldozes and just takes over. So that was really helpful. Can you tell us just briefly about some of the activities that you've been involved with, in the courts, in the testimony that you gave? I mean, what are some of the issues under kind of discussion there? Because it's quite interesting, again, is what evidence, from whose perspective, are things judged? So if you could just give us a sense of that, and I think it will be excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And do I have the capacity to share screen?
Yes, I can.
And I know we're running short on time. I'll just show a few images
Okay.
To talk with. See if I can.
So I've given you yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, So Arco recognizes this because he and I were there together with other members of the INREL team. This is at the very summit of Mauna Kea. You can see two telescopes, 2 of 13 in the background. And by the way, these are roughly a quarter the size of what the 30-meter telescope would be. In the foreground is something called an Ahu, AHU. It's a ceremonial structure of great antiquity, not this particular one, but the idea of these structures are deeply ancient in the Hawaiian tradition, and they've been used through Hawaiian culture in an unbroken chain. Their sites, their worship sites, I guess the best English translation would be an altar. Sites where people bring offerings to, food, salt, libations, and they're sites of commemoration. They're sites to put down, as some contemporary Hawaiians would describe it, intentions, to say their prayers to the ancestors, to pray, basically, to form a community and to pray. This particular Ahu is on the site of the proposed 30-meter telescope, and it was built there during the protests. In ceremony, and there are recordings of this, and it was done in a traditional style. And I've been involved in various reconsecration ceremonies of it, and I work with a gentleman named William Freitas, who was the kumu, or the teacher, who helped the community build this. He's a stone worker who specializes in this kind of structure. He asked me, upon learning who I was and that I had witnessed some of these ceremonies, if I would testify that the building of this constituted a traditional religious act, which would trigger protection under Hawaii state law. And I took that as a challenge, knowing full well that the state would throw out the argument. They'd say, no, it was built during the protest. How is this traditionally religious? But the challenge, why I wanted to make the case, even knowing it would likely fail, was partly animated by my commitment as a scholar of religion. Religion, as we know, is always unfolding. If we postulate pure pasts where things happened and then are done and are forever untouched after that, we're operating only at the level of fantasy. We have to talk about how religious formations come and go, how they're struggled over, how they get reanimated, how they're always and everywhere contested, whether that's obvious or not. All the more so for Hawaiian tradition, that the priests and the kings and the chiefs were often in league, and so much of ritual life was about marking territories, struggling over territories, commemorating the ancestors who died in that battle. These worship sites were all of that. So my argument went, a worship site, an Ahu built in a struggle with the state and with the Telescope Corporation that brought forward prayers to the ancestors and hopes for a future landscape without telescopes, a future where the land can be cared for in its own right. That's as traditional as it gets in a Hawaiian register. And that's also where theories of religion have been headed for a good long time, to think about the processual, contested nature of religion. So many scholars of religion, when we're asked to testify in court about such things, we put on a different hat where we agree to traffic in very simplistic packaged claims digestible by a court. And maybe that was the safer move on my part, to essentialize, if you will, but that wasn't going to work either in this case, because it was built on the protest site. So I thought, why not try to make a case that brings rough alignment into alignment, cutting edge scholarship on how religious traditions function, including in places like Hawaii, and the empirical evidence of this case of the community coming together for this purpose. So I tried to articulate that claim in court. And then the gentleman I worked with, William Freitas, he needed considerable help with his other witnesses, with his legal documents. So I became involved in that process of simply helping him craft his documents for well over a year, hundreds of pages of documents. And through that process, got to know others in the community. The short version there is, careful what you wish for. I don't regret it, but by offering to testify, I opened up a door to becoming deeply involved in the process and challenged at a variety of levels. The state court, by the way, ruled against this particular site. They said it was, quote unquote, merely political invention. So they disregarded the testimony. They disregarded William Freitas's claims. They threw out evidence, the video evidence of the community in prayer, and said, no, it was merely a moment of invention for the sake of protest. I get where they're coming from, because here religious freedom law runs headlong into the settler notions of property law, and the latter trumps the former in these kinds of cases, at least in the US settings. So that was quite predictable, but it's such an affront to the community itself, of course, in the first instance, but also to we theorists of religion. If that becomes how we think about religion, the possibilities of future religious life based upon present moments of antagonism and struggle, we will have nothing of meaning to study. I mean, this is what religious life looks like, pared down to the nitty gritty of getting through another rough day in a settler state for Indigenous peoples. So anyhow, you can see that it worked me up. It was an intense process. I'm still processing it, but I don't regret having tried to make the argument, because it was done so on principle. And I think it spoke to the situation on the ground in a way I couldn't have done otherwise.
Okay, thank you so much, Greg, for your like knowledge about this, and for sharing that with us. Greatly appreciated. I think our like seminar and discussion is going to be like enthusiastic and like lively, especially after this like video, and of course the like readings as well. So thank you for your time, and we will connect soon again.
Yeah, you're most welcome, and always happy to do it. And you take care. And students, really do pay attention to Noelani Goodyear Kaupoa's piece. It just charged on your theme of indigenous futures and ecologies. To me, that's such a rich piece, and I commend it to you wholeheartedly. All right, you all take care.
Thanks a lot.
Aloha.